By joining Basketball Canada, there's a potential there to truly have a mutually beneficial relationship for the good of all, both organizations and basketball across the country.
We're not saying we're going to go out and set the world on fire, but we just want people to know every night they take the court against the Grizzlies, they're going to be in for a tussle.
6 seconds. Byron Scott, 2 seconds. Yes! Chris King has won it for the Grizzlies.
The Vancouver Grizzlies select Bryant Reeves from Oklahoma State University. You think he's going to be a factor right away? Is it going to take him a couple of years?
Well, with big people, it takes time, and you have to be willing to wait on them and allow them to develop. And as an expansion franchise, I can't think of a better place for BC, big country, Bryant Reeves to be.
The Vancouver Grizzlies select Steve Francis from the University of Maryland.
I intend to do everything in my power to make this franchise a success in Vancouver.
The fans have been really supportive of the team, and the owners are falsely accusing them of not being supportive of the team. So,
come on, save our Grizzlies!
I would say one of the biggest disappointments in my life has been not being able to make the thing go in Canada. Nobody likes going through what we're going through with this relocation.
(1994). A late-season players' strike upends Major League Baseball, leading to the cancellation of the World Series for the first time in 90 years. Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain's death by suicide rocks the music world, and the NBA, with its global popularity skyrocketing, doubles down on its recent decision to expand into Canada. That April, less than 7 months after granting an expansion franchise to Toronto, the NBA's Board of Governors agreed to award a team to Vancouver, British Columbia, with both teams slated to begin play for the 1995-96 season.
It's a great day for Basketball Canada as an organization in that we're bringing two very key members of the basketball community into the organization as contributing members.
Toronto made sense. It's the biggest city in Canada, the country's cultural and financial center, and home to the NHL's most visible franchise and a Major League Baseball team that was fresh off consecutive World Series titles. Plus, Toronto was a basketball town back in the day. The short-lived Toronto Huskies were one of the original franchises in the Basketball Association of America, which was a forerunner to the NBA. It figured that pro basketball would eventually return to Toronto. But Vancouver? Different story. Vancouver is by no means a small town. It has over 500,000 people, and it actually boasts the 4th highest population density of any city in North America. But by NBA standards, it was a small market. A small market with no real basketball tradition or affinity either. Vancouver loves its hockey, and British Columbia is a big baseball province generally, but basketball? Not really a thing there. However, Vancouver had two things that made it extremely attractive to the NBA. A willingness to fork over an $125 million expansion fee, and a brand new arena. See, when the NBA agreed to grant a franchise to Vancouver, the team's original owner, Arthur Griffiths, already had plans in place to have a new arena built for his hockey team, the Vancouver Canucks. And this new 20,000-seat arena in downtown Vancouver, which would eventually be called General Motors Place, ultimately became a multi-purpose facility that Griffiths used to house both of his franchises, the Canucks and the Vancouver Grizzlies, a nickname that was finalized in the summer of '95. Were it not for the objections of the Canadian Royal Mounted Police, by the way, the team would have been called the Mounties. Instead, however, they chose a nod to the majestic and ferocious bear that roams the Pacific Northwest. So who was put in charge of stewarding and shaping these Grizzlies? That was put on the shoulders of Stu Jackson, the former New York Knicks head coach who had spent the previous few years on the sidelines at the University of Wisconsin. This, however, would be his first go at running a team. Jackson had no prior executive experience when the Grizzlies named him president and general manager.
By joining Basketball Canada, there's a potential there to truly have a mutually beneficial relationship for the good of all, both organizations and basketball across the country.
And it was a decision that many in Vancouver would come to lament, with Jackson eventually coming to embody the Grizzlies' failures. But the truth is, the Grizzlies were never given a real chance to succeed. And their extremely brief, extremely inglorious run in the NBA is ultimately reflective of how many obstacles the league put in their way from day one. Naturally, the Grizzlies ended up with little more than scraps in the '95 expansion draft. The only All-Star taken in the entire draft was B.J. Armstrong, and he went first overall to the Raptors, before refusing to report to Toronto and getting traded to Golden State. As for the biggest names the Grizzlies ended up with, Greg Anthony, a 34-year-old Byron Scott, a 30-year-old Blue Edwards, a 31-year-old Benoit Benjamin. That inaugural roster was not good. But that wasn't the problem. Expansion teams aren't supposed to be good. The problem was the barriers the NBA implemented to effectively stunt the Grizzlies' growth. See, for the 95 expansion, the NBA decided to make up some new rules for its two new franchises. First and foremost, neither Toronto nor Vancouver would be given a top 5 pick in the 95 entry draft. And get this, neither team would be eligible to pick first overall in the 96, 97, or 98 NBA drafts, no matter how bad they were in their first few seasons. Why? Because the league's owners were salty that the Orlando Magic, who joined the league in '89, had ridden a string of first overall bonanzas to some very quick dominance. With the number 1 overall pick in '92, Orlando drafted Shaquille O'Neal, and with the number 1 overall pick in '93, the Magic selected Chris Webber, whom they immediately dealt to Golden State for Penny Hardaway. By '93-94, the Magic were a 50-win team in just their 5th season. The rest of the NBA didn't want to see the same thing happen with its new Canadian teams, so they hamstrung Toronto and Vancouver in a big way. But that wasn't all. On top of that, for their first couple seasons, the Grizzlies and Raptors were only allowed to spend a maximum of 2/3 of the league's salary cap. Seriously. So, just to summarize, for multiple years out of the gate, the Grizzlies weren't allowed to pick first overall in the NBA draft, and they were limited in how much they could offer free agents, many of whom were already reticent about coming to play in a rainy and remote Canadian city with a heavy tax rate. That's what being set up to fail looks like. But Vancouver's basketball operations team didn't do themselves any favors either. Days after filling out the bulk of their roster via the expansion draft, the Grizzlies held the 6th overall pick in the 95 entry draft. And while the true difference makers were gone by the time they selected, including a teenage phenom named Kevin Garnett, who went 5th overall to Minnesota, the Grizzlies could have taken Damon Stoudemire, the eventual 95-96 Rookie of the Year and an integral piece in the Raptors' early years. Future All-Stars like Michael Finley and Theo Ratliff were also on the board. Instead, however, the Grizzlies ended up taking Bryant Reeves, aka Big Country, a bruising 7-foot center out of Oklahoma State.
Stu, you said you wanted a big man, and you got one with a lot of beef.
Yeah, we got one of the biggest. Obviously, we're extremely excited to get Big Country in our fold, and he's a guy that we feel will really endure the NBA season. He's got an excellent offensive game, great size, which is at a premium in this league, and he plays bigger in the bigger games.
He too would eventually come to embody the Grizzlies' failures. At the time though, both in the Grizzlies front office and throughout Vancouver, anticipation abounded. They had their team, they had their brand new arena, and they were ready to make NBA basketball thrive in Van City. Only it never did. Look, as excited as Vancouver was, everybody knew that the 95-96 campaign wasn't going to be a banner year for the Grizzlies, whose championship odds for their inaugural season were a cool plus 75,000. Still, nobody could have anticipated just how dreadful that first season would be, especially considering that it started on an incredible and unexpected high note. In their first ever regular season game, on the road in Portland, the Grizzlies were winners, riding a strong fourth quarter and a 29-point double-double from Benjamin to a 92-80 victory. And 2 days later, in their first game at General Motors Place, the Grizzlies introduced themselves to their home fans in storybook fashion.
Big night, big night.
First ever Grizzlies inaugural program.
It's game time. Time to get serious.
Okay, guys. This is our home court. We got a nice big crowd in here. Let's have some fun with it. Play hard.
For the second game in a row, the Grizzlies showed impressive fight, erasing a 14-point fourth quarter deficit to force overtime against the Timberwolves. And with time expiring in the extra frame, Chris King produced a core memory for Grizzlies fans.
It's going to be Byron Scott all the way to floater, in and out, the ball back, it goes, back he tipped it in, Chris King kept playing, Vancouver is 2-0.
Amazing, right? Well, from there, things got real in a hurry. Following their improbable 2-0 start, the Grizzlies didn't win their next game until mid-December, slogging through a stretch of 19 consecutive losses. But here's the craziest part. That wasn't even their longest losing streak of the season. From mid-February through early April, Vancouver suffered 23 straight losses, an NBA record at the time. This team wasn't just bad, they were atrocious. And by season's end, those initial highs were a distant memory. All told, the Grizzlies won just 15 games in 95-96, finishing with the worst record in the NBA and 6 fewer wins than the Raptors. And while there was no facet of the game in which this ragtag bunch excelled, their offense was historically inept. The inaugural Grizzlies were the first team in more than 40 years to average less than 90 points per game. Now for his part, Reeves, the team's most important building block, turned in solid numbers as a rookie, averaging more than 13 points and 7 rebounds per game. It was abundantly clear though that at the NBA level, Big Country was more of a contributor than a star. This was the kind of team, in other words, that desperately needed a first overall pick, a franchise cornerstone player to build around. And by right, having managed the worst record in the league, the Grizzlies should have had the best odds at winning the lottery for the '96 entry draft. Except, as I mentioned, they weren't allowed to win the lottery. Instead, Vancouver ended up with the 3rd overall pick, after the 76ers and the Raptors, and watched the draft's consensus top player, a phenom out of Georgetown named Allen Iverson, go 1st overall to Philadelphia. Ouch. With their 3rd pick, the Grizzlies drafted a gifted big man in Sharif Abdur-Rahim, who averaged more than 21 points and 8 rebounds per game and earned Pac-10 Player of the Year honors in his lone season at Cal. And while Reef went on to become an all-star and the most accomplished player in Vancouver history, that's undoubtedly a pick that Jackson would like to have back. A selection that contributed to the franchise's doomed trajectory. Because you know who else was available at number 3? Stephon Marbury, Ray Allen, Steve Nash, and a fellow by the name of Kobe Bryant. Ouch. Now, of course, in the moment, nobody knew that Kobe would become Kobe and that Allen and Nash would become Hall of Famers. So the Grizzlies, and the broader basketball world, were abuzz about Abdur-Rahim, and were optimistic that he would be an integral piece in Vancouver's likely lengthy quest for respectability.
You've got your legitimate center, you've got your power forward who could also swing it to 3, so you've got a great start for the Vancouver Grizzlies.
Short term though, Vancouver figured to at least take a step forward in their 2nd season. They clearly weren't a winning team yet, but with Abdur-Rahim and Reeves comprising their front court, they weren't going to be an absolute disaster again, right? Wrong. Amazingly, despite Abdur-Rahim making the all-rookie first team and an even better sophomore season from Reeves, the Grizzlies were worse in 96-97 than they were the year prior. For a 2nd straight season, they finished with the league's worst offensive rating, while their defensive rating ranked 27th among the NBA's 29 teams. They won consecutive games only once the entire season and endured 4 separate losing streaks of at least 7 games, their longest being a 15-game skid. Not surprisingly, their mid-season coaching change didn't reverse their fortunes. Actually, the team was slightly better under original head coach Brian Winters than they were under Stu Jackson, who named himself as head coach in January. All told, the Grizzlies ended up 14-68, finishing with the league's worst record for a 2nd straight season and cementing their dubious place in NBA history. Since the league adopted an 82-game schedule in 1967, only one other team had gone consecutive seasons with 15 or fewer wins. Again though, they were denied the number 1 pick in the ensuing draft despite their league worst record, and once again, they missed out on a future Hall of Famer. Instead of taking Tim Duncan 1st overall in 97, or even Chauncey Billups who went 3rd, the Grizzlies, picking 4th, took Antonio Daniels, the Bowling Green point guard who lasted 1 season in Vancouver before getting shipped out. 5 picks later, by the way, the Raptors selected Tracy McGrady. But that miscalculation wasn't the Grizzlies' lone blunder that offseason. A couple weeks after the draft, Jackson signed the first major contract of his tenure, inking Reeves to a 6-year extension worth a reported $65 million. That deal would age like milk. Still, by 97-98, 3 of Vancouver's starters were recent top 6 draft picks. No, they weren't Iverson or Duncan, but you'd think that some of that pedigree and talent would start to translate into more wins. You'd think. In reality though, the Grizzlies continued to stink. They won only 19 games in their 3rd season, as Daniels was a huge disappointment, hence the offseason trade. Though new head coach Brian Hill managed to get their offense into respectable territory, their defense remained a complete disaster, with the Grizzlies finishing 28th in the league in points allowed per game and defensive rating.
It was one of those nights where, we couldn't buy a whole lot. I think the first half we shot 35%. We got a lot of good looks, but, we just didn't get anything to fall, and it was a tough night all night for me.
It just wasn't working, and their continued struggles were followed by yet another draft blunder on Jackson's part. In '98, the Grizzlies ended up with the 2nd overall pick, their highest draft pick yet. But instead of taking Vince Carter or Dirk Nowitzki or Paul Pierce or even Anton Jamison, Vancouver selected Mike Bibby, a solid player for sure, but not the kind of transformative talent that the Grizzlies needed and that was readily available. And shocker, when the lockout-shortened 98-99 campaign got underway, the Grizzlies were still bad. Terrible, in fact. And that's when the wheels really started to come off. First, Steve Francis, their would-be savior and an eventual 3-time NBA All-Star, refused to report to Vancouver after the Grizzlies took him 2nd overall in the '99 draft. which frankly remains a shock because he looked elated after his name was called on draft night.
With the second pick in the 1999 NBA draft, the Vancouver Grizzlies select Steve Francis from the University of Maryland.
Steve Francis, 300 of your extended family here tonight. The draft in your hometown, what has it been like these past couple of days?
It's been real exciting for me. You know, leading up to the draft, I've always wanted to be a professional basketball player, and I'm just glad that I'm selected to be involved in the draft.
He wouldn't even say Vancouver or Grizzlies after getting picked. Epic. Anyway, an obstinate Francis was eventually shipped to Houston in a 3-team megadeal. In the process, he became persona non grata in Vancouver, and Grizzlies fans did everything in their power to make his life miserable when Francis came back to Vancouver as a member of the Rockets. But by 1999-2000, booing Steve Francis was just about the only thing that could compel Vancouverites to go watch the Grizzlies. After 4 miserable seasons, and with no savior in sight, the fanbase's interest had waned. That year, as the Grizzlies stumbled to 22 wins, less than 600,000 fans came through the turnstiles, giving Vancouver the 3rd lowest attendance figure in the league. And oh yeah, remember how I said Reeves' contract aged like milk? Well, that year, after dropping off in a big way the season prior, he averaged less than 9 points per game amid increasing concern over his weight, athleticism, and durability. He'd play only 1 more season in the NBA after that. But by that point, the Vancouver Grizzlies had bigger problems. See, by 1999, even though they weren't even a half-decade removed from their founding, John McCaw, who had bought the Grizzlies from their original owners years prior, was looking to sell. After all, the Canadian dollar was weak, the taxes were high, and the franchise's outlook was bleak, both short-term on the court and long-term financially, given Vancouver's relatively small corporate base. In 1999, in fact, McCaw actually reached an agreement to sell the Grizzlies to billionaire and Missouri native Bill Laurie, but the deal collapsed after the league made it clear that it wouldn't allow him to relocate the team to St. Louis. Still, the writing was on the wall, and believe it or not, only days after Laurie's deal fell through, McCaw agreed to terms with another buyer, Chicago-based billionaire Michael Heisley, who, comparatively, seemed more inclined to try to make the Grizzlies work in Vancouver.
I intend to do everything in my power to make this franchise a success in Vancouver.
Nice words. Unfortunately for Vancouver fans, they weren't true. By the start of the 2000-2001 season, after an offseason of turnover that most notably saw Jackson resign as president and GM, Heisley was already laying the groundwork for relocation. That October, Heisley claimed that his new team would lose a record amount of money over the coming season, and pointedly said that he wasn't willing to eat significant losses for an extended time. And sure enough, later that season, as the Grizzlies continued to languish in the Western Conference basement and struggle at the box office, Heisley received permission from the NBA to start exploring relocation options. Among those cities that lobbied the hardest, Louisville, Kentucky, Anaheim, California, and New Orleans, Louisiana, which actually did land an NBA team shortly thereafter when the Charlotte Hornets moved to the Big Easy. In the end though, the city that managed to snag the Grizzlies was Memphis, Tennessee, Bluff City, which isn't a significantly larger market than Vancouver, but it did have a couple key elements going for it. A promise of a new publicly funded downtown arena that would eventually be called the FedEx Forum, with naming rights purchased by one of Memphis's biggest corporate powers. And B, a much stronger basketball tradition than Vancouver. Memphis is a football town first and foremost, but the basketball program at the University of Memphis is an unmistakable point of pride, and the city actually had a pro basketball team for a brief moment in the 70s. Prior to the NBA's merger with the American Basketball Association, Memphis had an ABA team, and that was enough for Heisley. He decided on Memphis, and in the summer of 2001, the NBA unanimously approved the Grizzlies' move to Tennessee, marking the league's first relocation since the Kings' move from KC to Sacramento in 1985.
I would say one of the biggest disappointments in my life has been not being able to make the thing go in Canada.
The Memphis Grizzlies would begin play at the start of the 2001-2002 campaign. Incidentally, ahead of their fresh start in Memphis, the Grizzlies effectively blew up their roster, trading away Abdur-Rahim, the franchise's all-time leader in points and rebounds, and Bibby, the franchise's all-time leader in assists. In exchange for Abdur-Rahim, the Grizzlies acquired the rights to Atlanta's 3rd overall pick in the 2001 draft, a 21-year-old Spaniard named Pau Gasol. Just like that though, as quickly as they had arrived, the Vancouver Grizzlies were gone. And while their time in the NBA was extremely brief, their incredible ineptitude makes them impossible to forget. In 6 seasons in Vancouver, the Grizzlies compiled a record of 101 and 359. Their high-water mark for wins in a season was 23, Only once did they finish higher than last place in their division, and they put together the league's worst record 3 times. At no point were they anything but terrible. However, with the benefit of hindsight, it's undeniable that this team was destined to fail. Sure, mismanagement played a part, and Vancouver's draft record was particularly abysmal, but the NBA simply placed too many structural barriers for the Grizzlies to overcome. As a pro basketball team in a remote Canadian city, the Grizzlies were already facing an uphill battle, yet the NBA still went out of its way to make life harder on them. But in spite of the Grizzlies' profound struggles, their 6-year run left an indelible mark on Vancouver and ultimately helped turn the hockey haven into a basketball town. Today, more than 20 years removed from the Grizzlies' last game in Vancouver, the city still longs for NBA basketball. A 2024 poll showed that 3 in 5 BC residents were very much in favor of Vancouver getting an NBA team back, and NBA Commissioner Adam Silver acknowledged the city's ongoing interest back in 2023. Maybe, one day, Vancouver will get another shot at an NBA franchise. And hopefully, the second time around, they'll get a fairer shake.